Dialogue Conspiracy with Mae Brussell. For the past 14 years, Mae has been researching the facts behind political assassinations and abuses of power in this country. Her program relates the news of the week to political conspiracies. Dialogue Conspiracy originates with KLRB-FM in Carmel, California. And now, Mae Brussell.
Good afternoon. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's Dialogue Conspiracy number 286, September the 12th, 1977. Last week on Dialogue Conspiracy, I mentioned the Dutch journalist Willem Altman, who was going to reveal the witness who had information about the assassination of John Kennedy and who ordered the assassination of John Kennedy. Mr. Altman was on Good Morning America this last week. It was a total news blockout. There was no information about his interview in any of the media, and if you happened to catch it around 7:15 in the morning, you were lucky. It was August the 7th, 1977. Altman had gone to the studio the day before, and two gentlemen had blocked him and wouldn't let him in. Ted Gandolfo, the researcher, accompanied him to the station in New York City, and there was quite a scene there. Gandolfo was furious that Altman wasn't allowed up to do the TV show, and they gave some excuse for his not coming in, and it looked like the information would be suppressed. But they did allow him to come the next morning, and he got on the national television and mentioned a Bulgarian citizen that had come to the United States at the time that Franklin Roosevelt was president and became a member of the intelligence community and did secret missions for the United States in Europe. He knew President Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, President Truman, and this person's family name was Dimitriv, and he was, as a Bulgarian, and he became an automatic general, General Donaldson in the United States Army. They gave him that name, and he was sent back to Europe and also in the United States for secret missions. And, Donaldson is the gentleman who knows who ordered the killing of President Kennedy. As a matter of fact, he had told President Kennedy about it before the president went to Dallas, and the Secret Service assured John Kennedy that everything was taken care of. Senator Church received information about the assassination of John Kennedy, claims he doesn't know anything about it, that he didn't get the letter, and yet this gentleman seems to have proof that it was in his hands and that he knew. And he also claims that Gerald Ford got the information of who killed John Kennedy, and that they're all sitting on this story and blocking it. Of course, if you wonder why the Associated Press and the United Press and the Time Magazine, Newsweek, the major news media in the United States don't cover this story in television, or the Washington Post or the New York Times, you can appreciate it when you get the new Rolling Stone that just came out. There's a news story today on the front page of the New York Times that 400 persons in the news media, including CBS and the New York Times, are affiliated with the Central Intelligence Agency. All the researchers know that the New York Times was publisher of the Warren Report when it first came out. It was Harrison Salisbury from the New York Times that said that anyone who questioned the Warren Report was mentally sick and deranged. The new report put out by Bob Woodward for Rolling Stones mentions the CBS. Every few years, CBS puts out a total lying movie, a propaganda movie that I've talked about on Dialogue Conspiracy, about Lee Harvey Oswald being the assassin and no conspiracy in Dallas. And of course, there's people that have worked for Henry Luce, such as Robert Kaiser, who went immediately to see Sirhan Sirhan and wrote RFK Must Die. And Henry Luce has hired many reporters to become part of the intelligence community to continue the lies of the political assassinations. It isn't easy to get the information out. The researchers, many of us, have facts to prove without any doubt that Lee Harvey Oswald worked for the intelligence community, the Sirhan family came over through the CIA, and that the assassinations were set up to make certain people patsies and let the guilty assassins out free on the streets. The reason the information doesn't get to more people is because if there's an article today that says 400 people in the news media are CIA, that means there's many, many more. I know that every FM radio station, at least in the height of the anti-war movement, had an agent in residence. Every newspaper, an alternative newspaper, has a CIA agent in residence. And it's very easy when you do the research to know who's coming down and who is closing off the radio stations, who's cutting off the information of these conspiracies. and link them to the intelligence community. It's a news story, the 400 people. You'll be hearing more about it in the next few weeks, the 400 persons working for the CIA in the news media. It's not a surprise to the researchers. It's like trying to hit a brick wall constantly for 14 years now. 14 years this November. One lie after another lie. And a perfect example is this shocking story about the heads of states like President Ford, ex-President Ford, or Senator Church, knowing who killed John Kennedy, and the high officials in government knowing. He mentioned Ted Sorensen knows, and these people know, and yet there isn't anything in any of the newspapers around the country. It's a total news blackout. It's what Richard Nixon called benign neglect. I get very angry at the TV series blaming Richard Nixon for so much that happened at Watergate or the evils in the country. There isn't anything that went on during Richard Nixon's administration that wasn't happening before, and there isn't anything that he did that hasn't continued since he's out of office. It's very easy to make Richard Nixon the scapegoat, but I hope you don't take the easy route out and think that Watergate is over. Well, this is September the 12th. On September the 14th, Lauren Hall, a prime witness to the Kennedy assassination, is supposed to return to Washington to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. He appeared before them June the 7th, and then he invoked the Fifth Amendment. He was only asked one question: were you in Dallas November 22nd, 1963? There are many allegations that Lauren Hall was one of 4 or more assassins. The Warren Report said that Lee Harvey Oswald did the killing alone. Lauren Hall has said everyone knows the Warren Report was a whitewash. He's going back to Washington. I guess he's on his way now. And what he has announced to the committee and people in California is what you're going to get is a polite string of fifths. I imagine he'll be as silent as G. Gordon Liddy was for 5 years regarding the Watergate. After George de Mohrenschildt was killed, and Carlos Prios-Siqueiros and Charles Nicoletti and Kenny O'Donnell and John Rosselli and Sam Giancana, William Harvey, Sheffield Edwards, plus 109 more other persons who had information on the Kennedy assassination, it isn't hard to realize that Lauren Hall isn't going to say very much. They do want to ask him about his deportation from Cuba. He was sent out of Cuba in July 1959 along with Santos Trafficante, who was to have had foreknowledge of the assassination of John Kennedy. Trafficante is the last of that team alive. He worked closely with Carlos Prios-Siqueiros and John Rosselli and Sam Giancana. Trafficante testified in Washington. He testified, I refused to say anything, and he took the fifth and went home. So that Lauren Hall and Trafficante will not say anything to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Hall will be asked about his leaving Cuba with Santos Trafficante. He'll be asked about his visit with a witness named Sylvia Odio. He was in the company of a man named Lawrence Howard and William Seymour. In September of 1963, the assassination was in November 1963, they want to ask him about a man named Lester Logue, who had received $50,000, an offer to kill John Kennedy. And he will be asked about Warren Commission document number 1179, where Lauren Hall had redeemed a rifle that he had previously pawned, which was identical to the rifle supposedly found in Dealey Plaza at the time John Kennedy was killed. And the FBI has been suspicious in their handling of Lauren Hall and this rifle, and those are some of the questions he will be asked. I don't think he'll answer anything, and the taxpayer will get very little for their money putting up $1 or $2 million for the committee in Washington. I think they're going to get a good slice of murdering of witnesses and then a good hunk of Fifth Amendments to cover up. One will balance the other. I do want to go some more this week, the remainder of the program, to continue the mind control subject that I did last week, because I think it's very important, and probably I should be doing a lot of it every week on Dialogue Conspiracy. It's a problem which is important because, along with the news media cover-up of the assassinations, the control of the witnesses of murdering them is important, and also the manipulation of the minds of the witnesses, the people at large, like you and me out here, who are supposed to reason or think things out for ourselves if we're given a set of facts. Not only are the facts manipulated by the major media, and there's outright lies and perjury and falsification of testimony and forgery, but people who saw evidence of these conspiracies are locked into mental hospitals, and I think it's a pattern that's going to continue. It's not going to slow down. The witness who saw a man leave the rooming house where James Earl Ray was to have shot Martin Luther King, according to the official story. Mrs. Stevens was put in a mental hospital for years because the person that she saw didn't fit the description of James Earl Ray. Abraham Bolden was put in a mental hospital. He was in Chicago and told the Warren Commission, as a member of the Secret Service, of the plot to kill John Kennedy in Chicago. He was locked up in a mental hospital for years and still isn't allowed to give testimony to the committee in Washington. Walter Scott was put in a mental hospital when he broke the story that Patty Hearst was taken to a farmhouse in Pennsylvania and that his brother, Jack Scott, and sister-in-law, Mickey Scott, took Patty Hearst from the Las Vegas area to Pennsylvania and New York and back. The Scotts were never charged with transporting the Harrises or Patty Hearst, but Walter Scott was put in a mental hospital. There was an Earth News Bulletin, July the 6th, just a month and a half ago, on psychiatric implications of the new Senate bill. There was a lot of protest before the elections last year on this controversial Senate bill, which is now being packaged again. This time it's called S1437, and the Citizens Commission on Human Rights, that's affiliated with the Church of Scientology, said that sections of S1437 will pave the way for a psychiatric police state. Under this new bill, a person could be arrested and held involuntarily in a mental institution for up to 100 days to determine competency to stand trial. If found incompetent, he could be held a year in a mental hospital without being convicted. If the person is found not guilty by reason of insanity, he can be detained indefinitely, even beyond the sentence prescribed by the courts. The implications of the psychiatric sections of the bill are obvious, said the Citizens Commission on Human Rights. Now, here's the point about the use of these chemicals for mind control, or surgery for mind control, or electric shock for mind control, is that you can take a suspect who's perfectly normal, but you want to get off the streets, a labor organizer, a protester, or an author, and you can put them in a mental hospital, just round them up as a suspect for meeting with terrorists or meeting with somebody who wants to overthrow the government. Then they can be given those treatments that cause a mental disease, any chemical, food substance, drink, or surgical substance or electric technique. Then they can say this person is not sane enough to appear for trial, and then they can be removed permanently from society. If they're not kidnapped, the technique is there. So that all they need now is the law to literally kidnap citizens and then declare them mentally ill because they have the techniques to make them mentally ill. You remember at the height of Watergate, there was a plan the Attorney General had, no less the Attorney General, to take radicals and leaders of the left or protesters to Richard Nixon's Vietnam War or the bombing in Cambodia. The plan was to take these people and kidnap them and take them to Mexico. But this is a much easier way. If you put something in their food and make them appear irrational, you don't have to take them so far. You just zonk them out with the medications that the CIA now has. And then you say they are mentally too sick to stand trial. As proof of their mental state, you can see them and then take them away. They're discredited. They never have to have any kind of trial or be guilty of a crime. They can be a suspect and locked up. And that is part of the new Senate Bill 1 that's now called S1437. Mr. Stansfield Turner, the head of the CIA, made a statement just recently, about a month ago, that the CIA was never using these drug testing techniques anymore, that they stopped it in 63 or 65, and that there's no such thing going on at the present time or since that date. I remember on KLRB I did mention that I thought Mr. Turner was a liar, and somebody said that's pretty strong wording to use on the air to call the head of the CIA a liar. But he is, in fact, a liar, and it's not true that they're not using these drugs. Jack Anderson reminded readers this week, September the 9th, under an article called The Anderson Plot, that G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt intended to do him in at the height of Watergate. And some of you remember they were going to put a drug on his steering wheel that would go through his gloves and poison him that he could die from, or they were going to put poison in his drinks, but they found out he doesn't drink liquor, and they thought about putting poison in his toothpaste. And Anderson said now that he has E. Howard Hunt's version of what they were going to do, and he said they were going to make me an involuntary subject of CIA's MK Ultra Delta research. This was the secret behavior altering program that sent Dr. Frank Colson diving to his death through a New York City hotel window. This is Jack Anderson. He said E. Howard Hunt got the motivation for using the MK Ultra chemicals from Richard Nixon, who used the formula and the resources of the federal government to discredit us. Ex-White House aide Charles Colson, that's the man who found Jesus while under fire, testified that he was asked by President Nixon to take action against Jack Anderson, to discredit Jack Anderson. G. Gordon Liddy had a revolver, Anderson said, and was ready to shoot him. And they persuaded Liddy that they shouldn't hit him, that there was a misunderstanding, he shouldn't give him a hint. But he goes on to say Charles Colson remembered that Hunt came to his office with harebrained schemes on drugging Jack Anderson. As Hunt remembered that Colson was the instigator. He called Hunt and said, Anderson's a great thorn in the side of the president. Let's discredit him. So they went to the CIA and they called a former CIA physician, Dr. Edward Gunn, who had knowledge of the unorthodox administration of behavior-changing or altering substances. And Gunn testified that Hunt Liddy had a meeting with him, E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy. And I was asked, he said, if I could help provide hallucinating medications to an individual. The purpose of the Hunt plan was to find out something about these drugs and their application to a particular individual, in this instance, Jack Anderson. There originally was a story of a plot to assassinate Jack Anderson, story of poisons that leave no trace of a medical substance on autopsy. The word assassination and poison and autopsy, Anderson said, were discussed, but they favored using the mind-altering drugs, and they were going to hallucinate him while driving to the station so that he'd make an idiot of himself. Now, this was at the height of Watergate in 1973, which proves without any doubt that the CIA had these drugs available, their agents had them. E. Howard Hunt was affiliated with the CIA at the time of Watergate, and yet the now head of the CIA, Admiral Stansfield Turner, says that this program ended. And as I've said many times, the key word is testing. The testing may have ended in 1963, but the application is going on today and tomorrow because they have the warehouse of drugs. Another victim of this drugging at the same time that they were going to discredit Jack Anderson was Martha Mitchell. And I think, I don't know how many of you heard the David Frost, Richard Nixon tapes this week. I think it was the most disgusting exhibit of a gentleman, if you can call him a gentleman, he's not, of a person getting on the air and blaming the deceased Martha Mitchell for being so crazy that she was behind Watergate, when the evidence and facts is so far removed from this that Richard Nixon is not only a desperate man, but I believe under the control of some kind of programming himself of hypnosis and suggestion, because he gets on the screen and tells a story that is really pathetic. But I have a copy here of the transcript of that tape in case any of you didn't hear it, or in case you did hear it. It bears some repetition. Richard Nixon, the former president of the United States, was saying, you see, John's problem was not Watergate, it was Martha. It was one of the personal tragedies of our time. Richard Nixon said, I was the only one in the administration except Rosemary Woods that knew that Martha had a problem. She called Helen Thomas sometime. He said in 1968, Martha was away for 5 or 6 weeks, and I didn't know it, but she was an emotionally disturbed person. Then Richard Nixon begins, and this is the height of the Watergate. He says those midnight calls came and so forth and so on. And then came the campaign for his re-election in 1972. And you remember the Watergate came in June. So they had a lot of covering up between June and November election, and they didn't appreciate Martha Mitchell blabbing. He said it began to go up and up, I mean the tempo of her calls, and she busted her hand through a window out here in California and all the rest. and said she was going to blow the whistle on everybody and that John was doing this and being made a scapegoat, and words to that effect. Now, Richard Nixon, the President of the United States, is trying to say that Martha Mitchell is mentally sick because she busted her hand in California. He didn't go on to say that she was given an injection by Steve King, who's not a doctor. He's a CIA agent. She was taken to a hospital in Santa Ana by Herbert Kalmbach, the spy bag money for the Richard Nixon administration, that she was entered in the hospital not as Martha Mitchell, a mentally disturbed person, but they used an alias, and even I think they used the name of Herbert Kalmbach's wife to get her in there, and that her hand went through the window because she was fighting with these people to get out of the window. She had called Helen Thomas and had said that there were dirty tricks going on and that her husband would be made a scapegoat and that she was literally kidnapped. Her hand went through a window and she had stitches, not because she was mentally sick, but because 5 men were sitting on her and she was struggling to get free. Richard Nixon said, I talked to John about Martha shortly before the election, and she was acting up a bit. And I said, John, why don't you put her away like you did in 1968? Oh, Bibi Rebozo, their good friend, who was the bagman of the Howard Hughes money, who worked with Robert May, who was behind the assassination teams. Bibi Rebozo had this unlimited funding, the conduit, with Richard Nixon through his political career. He said, John, why don't you put her away like in 68? Imagine the nerve of these people wanting to lock Martha Mitchell up. The solution later was to lock her in an apartment until she had this deadly rare cancer and then died 3 years later. Richard Nixon said she was emotionally disturbed. It wasn't just booze. Sometimes she could be this way with no drinks, and sometimes perfect with a lot of drinks. So I'll never forget the campaign. It was towards the end of the campaign in September or October. And this is where Martha Mitchell began to be discredited so they could totally lock her up. It wasn't the booze, is right. There were drugs in her drinks and chemicals in her injections that they did away with her, and now they're trying to make her a scapegoat. Richard Nixon said he talked on the telephone, how are things going, John? And John said, please talk to my little girl, meaning Martha. And Martha Mitchell talked to the President of the United States and said, I love John, I love Bibi, and I love you. And then Richard Nixon said, at midnight, she started raising hell about everything. Okay, we come to the Watergate period. I mean, when Watergate was really happening by now. This is just up to election. We're coming now to the period where the axe is going to fall on John. And I must say, I did make statements. And when Dean came in and said, draw the wagons in around the White House, Mitchell's the guy. Richard Nixon admits that when the election came down, he was saying on his tapes what Martha Mitchell was saying, but by then she was drugged and well on her way to cancer and being discredited. And he goes on to say, let me summarize, I'm convinced if it hadn't been for Martha, and God rest her soul, because she in her heart was a good person, she had a mental and emotional problem that nobody knew about. If it hadn't been for Martha, there'd be no Watergate because John was minding the store. The actual truth of the whole Watergate saga is that if it hadn't been for Martha Mitchell calling Helen Thomas, Richard Nixon would still be president. He's right about that, but he turned it around to say that she was mentally sick and distracted the Attorney General. Martha had nothing to do with hiring all the whorehouses and the boats where they were going to get the congressmen and blackmail them for years to come down at the convention. She had nothing with planning the riots in Chicago or in Miami. She had no part of hiring these teams to burglarize the hotel where she stayed. Martha knew too much, and she was a victim, and the President of the United States, the former president, has the nerve to try to make her out as mentally deranged. And the only reason he can make her out as being somewhat irrational through this whole period is because she received the same kind of drugs that they were going to give to Jack Anderson, except that he had a family watching him and teams watching the cars, and he was more protected. He was living at home with his family and working with his associates. Martha Mitchell was locked up in the apartment of Mr. Marriott in New York City with not English-speaking help. She had no friends could come and see her. She was totally confined until she was good and injected and poisoned, and then she wasn't seen, and then her bones began to crumble and fall and became brittle. John never called on her in the hospital. Her daughter couldn't see her, and she died the loneliest kind of death, and no one was around her at the time. It was really a tragic story of what this government can do to its own, and it's a sad lesson. But this is an example of current drugging and mind control of Martha Mitchell and Jack Anderson, and the experiments that are breaking in the news have been going on since 1947, not 1953, as stated in some of the reports. It's been 1947, and it's going on to the present. Last week on Dialogue Conspiracy, I talked about the mind control program, the stories breaking since August 1977, first in the New York Times and then in the major media. And I listed the purposes of the program for you. I would love to read them over again, but it takes a lot of time, and I think maybe if you want them, you can get the tape from me from the show from last week. And we'll go on not only the purposes of the mind control program, but I will mention again some of the methods that have been used, admitted by the CIA, coming out recently from the new documents. There's now 8,000 pages declassified. These were into 86 private institutions, $25 million spent over 25 years. I talked about their purchasing lime for testing burial of animals, buying tetanus toxoid, using brothels, chemical combinations that would alter human behavior, a list of about 40 chemicals that were combined, 1 or 2 or 3 in any number, the use of finding morphine-like molecules in the human brain, thorazines, studying the cerebral state of patients and their toxic state, using blood serums and putting lead on the skin, finding no lesions and causing death. People were sealed in rooms. No circumstances of death could be discovered. And I talked about 100 kinds of drugs they've listed, actually, and 3 were their favorites that were the most potent barbiturates. And these were experimented on people in mental hospitals as well as what they call normal people with no problems at all, university students or persons with good mental conditions who were surreptitiously given these doses. There were also the use of electrode implants, isolated nurses kept in rooms until they became schizophrenic, electrodes at Tulane University in Louisiana with biopsychiatrists so that they used surgery and LSD at the same time, and electroshock, a chemical called bulbcaprine that was tested on animals, and they didn't clarify if it was used on humans. Germs of all kinds used along with the MK Ultra plan. Viruses that were tested, at least 2 cultures of whooping cough, and canine bacterial infections used by the U.S. Army Bacteriological Warfare Center. I just read recently that animals, dogs, have been seen to be a cause of multiple sclerosis. And I'm wondering, with these experiments through the years, how many dogs had diseases that maybe possibly could have passed them on to humans. They were testing viruses and canine bacterial infections. Birds were used for warfare, germ warfare, to carry diseases. Dogs and monkeys in isolated states were given diseases and drug combinations. Electronic devices were used to test with remote control electric devices on brain waves, and they used various plants and rare fungicides. The deaths of some of these witnesses that were doing the research are being reported now. It's similar to the exposés on the Kennedy assassination or the various other stories, such as when the Lockheed story broke in Japan. The U.S. government, through CIA, was funding money from Lockheed to persons high up in government in Japan. 7 people who received money immediately died, and all of a sudden the Lockheed case is closed. You don't hear another word about it. The fatality of people working on the drug programs are dead. There's a Dr. Alex Canty, a psychologist that was affiliated with court information up in Detroit. They were it was in Michigan, Detroit, Michigan, where they took the court records of individuals and went into the jails and began to perform experiments on them. One of the psychologists that obtained the court records is dead. His son, Dr. Alice Canty Jr., said his father was involved with the CIA. There's a Dr. John Cook, who's now dead. There's a Dr. Jerry Robertson, who conducted research for the CIA, who's now dead. These people just died recently, and they were associated with hypnotic research that was called, in quotes, mildly hair-raising. A Dr. Max Ringel did LSD research at Boston Psychopathic Hospital. It was Dr. Dr. Wrinkle died 1972, just after Watergate, that time. Morgan Hill is dead. He's the CIA agent who directed the San Francisco safe houses. He died 2 years ago in 1975, just when the links of the CIA safe houses to Watergate were breaking in San Francisco. I met with Mr. Bruce Roberts, who wrote the Gemstone Papers and gave them to me in 1972. And he took me to a bar on Geary Street and gave me information about the CIA brothels and mentioned that the Watergate defendants were out in San Francisco frequently, and the CIA was out there frequently, and the bartender died shortly after I had been there with Mr. Roberts, and this last year Bruce Roberts died of a brain cancer. Dr. D. Ewan Cameron from the Allen Memorial Institute of Psychiatry, McGill University in Canada. He did experiments on behavior control, the effects of isolation and sensory deprivation for humans in the CIA. He worked with Alan Dulles and Richard Helms. He died in 1967. A lot of changes took place in 1972 after Watergate, and a lot of people have died in the years right up to the present time that were part of these experiments who might not have just died of old age, because a large number of them, you read their names and you say, well, this doctor is a witness, he did this, and then you say, now deceased. Just like the Watergate, not the Watergate hearings, the CIA hearings with Frank Church in 1976. Sheffield Edwards of the CIA testified, and right after that he was dead. William Harvey testified. He supplied the weapons for the CIA assassination teams. Right after he testified, William Harvey was dead. The reason I'm so sure that these people have died, because they were important witnesses, is that I've mentioned before the gentleman who killed William Harvey had called me and told me how he did it, and that the CIA had, in fact, killed these people. And so as you read about the mind control and the papers coming out, they say former CIA are now deceased. There was a Dr. Robert Heidel who used LSD as a psychiatrist in Providence, Rhode Island at the Butler Health Center. He's now deceased. There's destruction of records, too. At Stanford University, the information came out that Stanford was doing drug testing from 1957 to 1964, but all of a sudden the denials come, and a Dr. Robert H. Alway, the dean of Stanford Medical School, at the time said that he's not aware of the CIA, but the papers are destroyed. You can see a pattern that always happens, the same pattern that happened after John Kennedy assassination began to be exposed. Takes place here again with the mind control, the same problem with the witnesses dying. The Stanford research team said that there was a fire that they couldn't check at Encino Hall in 1972, and that these files were destroyed. I think it's interesting. I went to Stanford, it was many years ago, but Encino Hall then was a boys' dormitory, or for the men, a dormitory, and I don't know why that building would be holding the psychological testing programs of the CIA unless Encino was burned down and a new dormitory was built. It seems it would be with part of the psychology department or the medical school, but of course, as luck would have it, the CIA files happened to be in Encino, and Encino Hall burned down in 1972, so that sweeps out the record of the Stanford links that were being exposed after Watergate in June 72. Stanford was involved in the testing of IQs, and the CIA had these projects, as I say, of trying to learn how to lower IQs. Well, the information coming out on the mind control is interesting. The Church Committee reports, the congressional reports of Rockefeller Committee reveal a lot. You can get those documents from the government printing office, the information being exposed since 1976 and now into 77. Of course, I've been following the mind control of the government for a long time. As a matter of fact, I wrote an article for the L.A. Star. It was published in the L.A. Star. This was in 1973. That was, oh my goodness, 4 years ago. And the name of the article was a long article called Behavior at UCLA Institute to Study Violent Behavior, the CIA Conduit. And it's an article about the CIA. It's titled Murderville, USA on Behavior Control at UCLA. And what I was fighting was Dr. Jolly West, who was supposed to be appointed by Ronald Reagan to head this infamous school to alter human behavior. And I started fighting it the day that Ronald Reagan announced the program. April the 11th, 1972, Ronald Reagan announced before the Senate Committee on Health, Education, and Welfare in Sacramento that he wanted to have this school to study the causes of violence at UCLA, and that Dr. Jolly West would be in head of that. The new revelations, of course, come out in the New York Times and in the new CIA reports that Dr. Jolly West is a CIA agent. He was a recipient of CIA money. I was writing about him in 72 and 73, and now in 77 we are getting the confirmation for the whole world to know of the role of Jolly West. I wrote this long article, and as much as time will allow, I'll read you some excerpts from it because I'm pretty proud of it. I wrote it in 1973. But at that time, in June 1973, there was an article in the Los Angeles Times saying, Watergate dims the hopes for the Center on Violence. The scandal aroused by Watergate, the fears of the projects, there's too many people that were suspicious of the UCLA project. And this is from the Los Angeles Times, June 15th, 1973. It says, there's growing public apprehension about the power of government to corrupt officials, threaten the future of UCLA's school for the new Center for the Study and Reduction of Violence, and the center's acting director, this Jolly West, said Thursday. 3 months ago, when there were plans to create the center, they were publicly announced, we thought nobody would object to a program aimed at controlling violence, Dr. Jolly West said. Remember, Jolly West is from the CIA. But today, the future looks gloomy for the center, mainly because anxieties of critics have raised doubt in the minds of legislatures and funding agencies. In addition, the Watergate revelations have provided an example of the power of people high in government to use science, and in this case, electronics, for nefarious purposes. Watergate revelations have raised the level of suspicions of the center's motives. I'm really proud of the role that I had. As I say, Ronald Reagan wanted April the 11th, 1972, to have the center to study violence. I knew Jolly West was in the CIA. He'd been Jack Ruby's psychiatrist. I knew he was. I was working hard and had gone to Sacramento and was trying to fight these hearings, to go up and say that this was a police state tactic of the Central Intelligence Agency that Ronald Reagan wanted to put into effect in April 1972. In June 72, the Watergate story broke, and of course I published Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped, which had to do with her drugging and injecting, and got out in August of 72. In June of 73, 1 year, less 2 days after the entry at the Watergate Hotel, the Center for Studying Violence, at least as they planned it at that time, was closed down. Jolly West said the center's future is in deep trouble because of Watergate. We've had 2 public hearings, and people are questioning the integrity of the government. Fears and critics of the center has been fed by apprehensions about the motives of their financial bankers because it's politically conservative and federal agencies are involved. You see, this is the federal CIA money that was going into there that I was stating right at the time that the CIA was going to do electrode implants and behavior changing and alteration and electric shock and drug testing and changing of human behavior at that school. This article in the LA Times in June 73 said Fred Heistand, an attorney who appeared before the Senate Committee May the 9th, representing the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the National Organization for Women, the Black Panther Party, the Mexican American Political Association, and the California Prisoners Union, said that underlying his client's requests were grave concerns about the proposed center had in encouraging or performing future behavior modification experiments on political protesters, prisoners, inmates of mental institutions, minorities, and women. And that was exactly what I was fighting that whole year. Then Watergate broke. He said they feared that a proposed center was a combination of a public relations gimmick and the state administration and academic boondoggle to prop up behavioral science, and that would turn into a clockwork orange for California. That was the institution that was described in the Committee on Judiciary, United States Senate. This was the last hearings of the Senate hearings on mental health before not Judge Sirica, but I'm trying to think of the head of the Senate Committee on Assassinations. It'll come to me in a minute. I think of Judge Sirican. It wasn't him. It's the staff of the Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights, November 1974. And I brought it in to read to you because this was a statement about that UCLA school. And I read the statement on Dialogue Conspiracy December the 9th, 1974. It was 3 years ago. And this is part of the CIA funding that was set up for California under Ronald Reagan. The Senate hearing said in January 73, in the state message, Ronald Reagan wanted to form a center for the reduction of life-threatening science in California and wanted funds from the California legislature and also from the federal government. The project is called the Study of Violent Behavior. In 1968, California officials secretly amalgamatized 3 prisoners, paying scant attention to their legal or ethical issues. That means they did chemical lobotomies on them. This serious tampering with the human brain yielded no favorable results for reducing crime or violence. In fact, the prison report by officials is the most, this is the prison reports that we have by the officials is to be, they should improve their rights in the prison. His old symptoms of this particular person have returned. He now suffers additional memory loss and other effects of brain destruction. This is one man in particular. There were 3 in 1968. A program of mind-crippling psychosurgery was nearly established in 1971 in California. Then the secret documents came to public attention and forced the Department of Corrections and the University of California in San Francisco, which agreed to perform operations, to back off from their plan. The proposed Center for the Study of Violence represents a resurrection of scientifically invalid, ethically deficient, and legally questionable practice. The present proposal represents only a small proportion of the research to be conducted by the center. No guidelines are clear. They want chemical castration, psychosurgery, testing experimental drugs on involuntary incarcerated individuals, and prominent features of the proposal are still unlisted. The project wants funds immediately, and they will intrude into human rights. In an age of rapidly advancing technology, when the cry for law and order at any cost is its most shrill, it is necessary to be more sensitive to the preservation of human dignity and fundamental principles of liberty and freedom. Pardon me. It is necessary to be sensitive to the possibility of political manipulation of scientific research to repress healthy dissent and legitimate disagreement in a changing society. Our examination of the proposed center convinces us it is particularly susceptible to political manipulation, totally devoid of protection of human rights and liberties, scientifically inadequate, and generally unresponsive to the need for a decrease in a level of violence in our culture. This is from the Senate Select Committee on the Judiciary, the second session, November 1974, on the School for Violence. I've been fighting the drug program, the surgical program, the electrical implant program for a long time, and I'm glad that a lot of the documents are coming out. There's now 8,000 pages being revealed, and as you see them in the news media, and John Marks will be writing a book about them, you can look back at the programs we've had on Dialogue Conspiracy and see why I've been yelling about these projects at least since 1971. Well, our time is up today. Keep your minds clear and stay away from those bad drugs from the CIA. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, and I'll see you next week if your mind is clear on Dialogue Conspiracy.
There is a truth, I thought to myself, while driving down Route 68. The car in front is a Renault. It's not behind, it's not a Ford. There is a truth of how things happen. If it was yesterday, it wasn't 1894. And if tomorrow gonna to come true, there'll be another truth in store. And those who think is no truth, that all depends on point of view, will lock us up, fire the bomb, made only for a gentleman to use. The president is just a choice, he should not incite or claim his fame. One November night, I heard the screaming horns and new America had changed her name. We're not the same, you and I are not. You who call free thinkers enemies, you are clearly now the enemies. And we will do what we must do to keep it free, like I must write, and she must sing, and they must slave. You must have heard that we will never really rise again. The minds behind the plastic mules gave the word. They cannot just mow us down. It's they who are the arch anemic ones. Ours are free and tender girls. Ours are mountain climbing sons. So you and I would disagree. Truth exists, but misery. I cry for you, I cry for us, as I prepare to leave the